How's it going, everybody? This is Ridiculously Awesome Machines. So today, this is going to be a two-component episode. So obviously the last two episodes, first episode was covering the components, last episode obviously here was covering cases. This episode is going to be covering both motherboards and CPUs. Reason being, CPUs and motherboards are a huge thing that I see people always making mistakes on. So when it comes to motherboards and CPUs, they're basically one and the same, because if you get the wrong CPU, if you get the wrong CPU for your motherboard, then it's a giant money waste and you're going to be hating yourself because you got the wrong motherboard or the wrong CPU. So I'm going to explain compatibility and the reason why you always need to read the description of your motherboard and your CPU. Obviously, what you choose first is up to you. You could have a really nice motherboard, but I would always recommend people check their work on the processor first, because your processor is going to be your main thing doing all the thinking for your computer. So I wouldn't judge your computer's build off of your motherboard. I would do it off of your CPU, but I will get into this. So, motherboards, first part of this. Big thing about motherboards, these are your four general types of motherboards. We're going to go over each of them and what their benefits and cons are. It's not going to be our last video, because our last video was covering directly pros and cons. There's a lot to cover in this video. I would like to go over pros and cons for these, but I'm just going to give you all more of a example of why these might be better than others. But let's get into this. We're going to be starting from left to right. Starting off on the left, we have an eATX board. What is that? It's an extended ATX board. So the next one, the next motherboard here is an ATX, and I'll elaborate what ATX stands for when I get to a normal ATX board. But extended ATX is quite literally, it's in the name. It's the same as an ATX motherboard, except wider. Generally, eATX boards don't normally fit into mid-sized towers. They're generally designed for large towers. For large towers, you might want to use this because it'll fill up more of that space and you won't have as much of a gap between your cable routing and your motherboard. Also, it depends on what kind of eATX you get. Some of them, if it's a server type motherboard, it could have a spot for two CPUs. eATX boards are not very common, but you can find them. Obviously, in this image here, this is just a variety of motherboards. And it goes through a bunch of different ones with Aorus, Gigabyte, MSI. A bunch of different manufacturers make motherboards. My biggest recommendations for motherboards is Aorus, MSI, Gigabyte, the three that are on here, and then there's a couple more. You also have... I'm trying to remember. If I get it, I'll come back to it. But eATX boards, they have pretty much the same layout as a normal motherboard. You have, on this one, you can see there's actually multiple PCIe slots. What are PCIe slots? They're the slots you use for your graphics card. And on the eATX one here, you can see that compared to the other ones, it actually has three graphics card, hardened graphics card slots. Compared to other motherboards, such as the ATX, which is the next one on the right, you can see it only has one of those silver ports. I'll bring my mouse over so you can see. So these little silver ports right here are PCIe slots. There's different variants of PCIe slots, but these are the ones used for graphics cards, and you can also put other stuff like a Wi-Fi card if by chance your motherboard doesn't have built-in Wi-Fi. I would always recommend that if you're ever going to get a motherboard, make sure in the description for the motherboard that it has built-in Wi-Fi, because what that does is it saves you money from having to buy a Wi-Fi card and install that onto your motherboard just so you can have Wi-Fi, compared to having it already built into the board, so you can either have the option of playing your PC off of Wi-Fi, or you can still have it hardwired with an Ethernet cable. But the main takeaways is it's a bigger board for the eATX. Obviously, it still has these 4 RAM slots. Most modern sized boards have 4 RAM slots. And generally, if they are made normal, they'll have dual channel, meaning that your 4 RAM slots, every other RAM slot will be linked to the other RAM. So the first and the third RAM slot will be linked together, and then the second and the fourth will be linked together. And generally, you want to, whenever you're getting RAM, have them all be the same, but that'll be covered in the RAM video. But like I said, eATX is quite literally just a wider version of an ATX board. It might have a couple newer things, but generally it's going to be the same. Also for eATX, you might notice that there's more room for heat sinks and stuff on the board. I've only really seen eATX boards on like newer gen computers, like new stuff that needs more cooling for the CPUs because the CPUs run hotter. But in my opinion, I would never really recommend an eATX board unless you really want a big motherboard. But yeah, there's not a lot to an ATX motherboard. These are your standard motherboards that you're usually going to see in any computer you're dealing with, whether it's a built computer, a pre-built, or even a school computer. You're generally going to see a board that's it's an ATX. An ATX motherboard is an Advanced Technology Extended motherboard. That's literally all it stands for. But in terms, that's just how they identify different motherboards, is using Advanced Technology Extended. And so it's kind of funny because for your eATX, it's literally Extended Advanced Technology Extended. It's kind of goofy how they named it, but they didn't really put a lot of thought behind it when they made that motherboard, apparently. But yeah, generally for your ATX motherboards, it consists of, just like the eATX, you have your main PCIe slots. Underneath this slot here, it's kind of hard to tell, but this one it's easier. This is another, technically a PCIe slot, but it's a PCIe slot designed for SSDs. So most modern motherboards will have a slot for a stick drive SSD that'll mount to the motherboard. It's for the stick drive SSD, it is referred to as an M.2. But obviously, more stuff that needs to be covered in this video. But it has a slot for your M.2 SSD. It has your four RAM slots. Usually, like I said, most ATX and eATX will have 4 RAM slots. It has your power for your motherboard, which is this big plug here. Your 2 power cables for your CPU are up here in the top left corner. And then down here are your SATA power for your storage. There's actually separate power cables. Normally, your computer might come with it. If not, you can always order SATA data cables, because SATA data cables are... It's also really funny because it rhymes. But SATA data cables are really handy because there's no like certain cable that you need to have. It's not like your power supply where you never want to mix and match power supply cables. SATA data cables are completely up to the user. So in my computer, I use red SATA data cables just so I know like where my cables run to, while the rest of my power supply uses black cables. And there are some different SATA data cables that you can get that have different upload speeds, but generally it doesn't matter what you get, because for my SATA data cables, they're being used for my hard drives, because my hard drives are they're big hard drives, and hard drives don't get made in a small format, so you need a SATA data and a power cable, which fortunately most power supplies, they come with a power cable for your storage. And then what you have down here are most likely PCIe 3.0, or usually they're 3.0 for these slots, because for the other PCIe slots, they get used for other stuff. So capture cards, which allows you to capture other consoles. And I'm actually going to soon, whenever I get the chance, I'm going to get a capture card and show you guys what a capture card does, because I'm going to use that capture card for recording me setting up BIOS and OS for you all, so you all can understand how the process goes without having to do a weird way of showing you. But yeah, usually you'll have a 3.0 and a 2.0, and on some of the newer motherboards, your PCIe slot up here for your graphics card is a 5.0, because the new graphics cards use different PCIe slots. So you also have to make sure you're looking at your GPU whenever you're looking at your motherboard, because if you have a 4.0 motherboard for your PCIe, then you're most likely only going to be able to use either most likely the highest you'll be able to go would be a 30 series for the NVIDIA graphics cards, and I think it's like 6000 series for the Radeon graphics cards. But yeah, it's a pretty standard setup. The other thing I would always recommend when getting motherboards is making sure they have this I/O shield. And what the I/O shield is it goes into the back of your computer. On your case, there's a spot on the back of your computer, and normally your motherboard should come with an I/O plate that will actually just clip right into that port. So when you mount your computer, all your cables have a shield on them, so you're not going to get a bunch of dust or anything inside the computer from the back of the computer. And as you can see on a couple of these, all of these actually have it. These little threaded spots on the back of these motherboards is actually the built-in Wi-Fi that I was talking about. When you get a motherboard with built-in Wi-Fi, they also give you an antenna that you can screw into the computer so you can actually use the Wi-Fi if you're not able to hardline it. But yeah, I mean, pretty much the big things I'd say for if you're going to get these two size motherboards, these motherboards, again, normally EATX is only going to fit in a full-size computer. Most mid-sizes will only fit ATX or below. So if you're going to be using a mid-size computer case, then you're most likely going to be sticking with an ATX. If you get a full-size, then obviously go to your wildest dreams, do an EATX. But also remember, with the EATXs, they try to slip in extra features, which makes it cost more. I'd usually stick around the ATX area, where you're only paying maybe about $200 for like a good ATX motherboard. If you're going like high end with like a bunch of LEDs on the board, then obviously you're going to spend more. But ATX for a mid-size case is one of my big recommendations. The next motherboard we're going to cover is the micro ATX. Micro ATX, these are generally the motherboards you're going to see in small form factor cases. These are the motherboards that generally, most of the time, will still have all 4 of their RAM slots, so you still have the potential for all that RAM, but they cut back on the amount of PCIe slots, because by doing that, it shrinks the size of the board, which lets it fit in a smaller case. So for this board, it has its normal slots. It actually has only 1 CPU power. So remember, if you only have 1 CPU power, there's a good chance that you're not going to be able to run like more modern ones. So you got to remember that if you're planning on making like a gaming build, you want to make sure if you're going to get a small board that it has the ability to do a lot of power. So like these 2 boards, they only have 1 slot for power for your CPU. So if you're running like a new gen CPU, there's a good chance it could just not have enough juice for your CPU because it's only got 1 power slot. This one also it has pretty much the same standards as the other ones. It has your your SATA data ports, has your motherboard power, obviously 4 RAM slots. It has an I/O shield, and it comes with 2 PCIe slots. It comes with 1 for your graphics card if you get one, and another one for whatever accessory. And this one, on this motherboard, it looks like it also comes with a M.2 slot, which would be underneath this panel here. Like I said, your M.2 slot depends on your board. I've seen some ATX motherboards that have slots for 3 M.2s. So always remember, if you're wanting to make your storage always be small, I would recommend M.2s, and you can also get motherboards that have more M.2 slots. This board basically functions the same as the other 2. Obviously, it's just a little smaller. So, like I said, you always got to remember, if you're doing a small build, you always got to account for what you're wanting with the computer. The last motherboard I'm going to cover is going to be an ITX. ITX motherboard stands for Information Technology Extended. pretty much it's the same as an ATX motherboard, but built in a smaller format. So in this instance, it has a couple less SATA data ports. It has only one PCIe slot. So that means if you wanted to have any type of graphics card in this thing, you have one slot. So this is a motherboard that I would recommend to anybody who is strictly using a computer for just office work. ITX motherboards are perfect for tiny builds if you want to make like a really small build. This motherboard here, from as far as I can see, I don't believe, unless this right here is a heat shield for a M.2 slot, it doesn't look like it has an M.2. It also only has the ability to have 2 RAM sticks in it, meaning either A, you're going to be running on, if you're only planning on having maybe 16 gigabytes, that's all you're going to be able to get, or you're going to have to buy RAM sticks that have more gigabytes on them. So you got to remember, if you're doing a small build, especially for ITX boards are highly like office focused kind of boards because they're not designed to have a lot going for them. They're designed to just hold your CPU, hold your GPU if you even get one. With this small of a board, I wouldn't even recommend a GPU, and also have connection points for your RAM and for your SATA data. ITX motherboards are very builder friendly because there's little that you have to do with them other than putting in your CPU and putting in your RAM and hooking up the very few power cables this has, because this thing here only has the motherboard power and the CPU power. That's it. There ain't nothing else for this computer compared to these ones where they have multiple power cables that power different things. So it's obviously a choice of what you're going to use your computer for. If you're going to use eATX, it's going to be a big computer. If you're going to use an ITX, you most likely could mount an ITX board into a mid-size case. I wouldn't recommend it though, because it's a really small motherboard for a big case. So you're kind of leaving a lot of open room compared to saving the money on a mid-size case and getting a small case that you can put an ITX board in, and then you can also figure out how you're going to do cooling. ITX boards, I say, they're good for building, but you also have to kind of know what you're doing, because when you get a small case to put an ITX in, you got to remember that you also got to plan for your cooling and all the other stuff. So I'd say a good baseline for anybody who wants to build either an office computer or a gaming computer, I would sit between ATX or MATX. I know it's a lot of information I threw your way, but I'm just trying to get y'all to understand the idea behind your choice of motherboard, because the smaller you go, the less components you can put into that motherboard. Compared to the bigger you go, obviously it's going to take more space, but you have a lot more room for stuff. Because in just this eATX board, I can already assume that there's at least 3 M.2 slots between these two heat shields. So just remember, it's all about, cost for what the use is going to be. And then another big thing, the reason why I wanted to cover CPUs while doing the motherboards is because your motherboard is going to dictate what CPU you use, and vice versa. Whatever CPU you use is going to dictate your motherboard. And I'll cover the reason why. Because there's 2 main CPUs that you're going to see. You're going to see Ryzen, which are going to be these chips here. And Ryzen, they have a bunch of different series. So whenever you talk about Ryzen, which is made by AMD, Ryzen is one of your main CPU producers. AMD is one of your main CPU producers. They produce the Ryzen CPU. For Ryzen, how they categorize their CPUs is by series. So you have the 3000, 5000, 7000, and 9000. Now, there is some in-between series, but generally, if it's not a 3, 5, 7, or 9, it's designed for laptops or for other mobile devices. So if you're building a computer, the main series you're wanting to look for is 3, 5, 7, or 9. Obviously, going from left to right is semi-old to newest, because obviously there's some older generations of Ryzen, but if I was going to recommend any series of Ryzen to you, I would recommend between the 3000 and the 9000 series, just because 3000's like early 2000s and 9000 is, I think, only released last year or this year. And when you go through these series, there's going to be different versions, such as my computer, I use a 5000 series CPU. What does that mean? So all that means is that it's a different generation, or it's a different series of Ryzen CPU. And so in those series, there are different types. You have a Ryzen, so mine is a 5600. Actually, I just upgraded mine recently. I lied to you. So they have different types of Ryzen CPUs. So let me pull it up for you. Oh, actually, no, I got it here. We're good. So how they separate it for Ryzen is they have it separated by series, which means it's a whole new generation of CPUs that they made, but then they also separate those generations into different types of CPUs. So to explain it in a simple format, I have a Ryzen 5950X, which means there's three types of Ryzens that you're always going to see. You're going to see a Ryzen 5, a Ryzen 7, and a Ryzen 9. What does that mean? So for a Ryzen 5, 7, and 9, it just means how many cores that that series of CPU has. So for Ryzen, I have a 5000 series, but it's a Ryzen 9. So reading them are a little weird when it comes to boxes. So in this case, if you look at the CPU on here, it's obviously a bit of an old generation. It's a Ryzen 7 1700X. But what does that mean? What that means is that this Ryzen is from generation 1000, or it's from series 1000, and it's a 7 series. That's why it's a 1 and a 700, 1700X. That's all that means. So for my computer, I have a Ryzen 5950X. So generally for Ryzen, what that means is that X means that the CPU is overclocked. Overclocking is a whole separate thing. I'm not going to explain it. But if I didn't have an overclocked one, then my CPU would be a Ryzen 5900, meaning that it's a 5000 series and it's a Ryzen 9. So I don't like explaining stuff to people like they're dumb, but it's simpler for me to explain it to you slowly so you can understand what type of CPU or what series of CPU and what type it is. And Intel is almost exactly the same way, and I will explain the same thing. But just for an example, say I wanted to move to a Ryzen 5, but I want it to be a 7000 series. So it's going to be a 7000 series, means it's going to start with a 7, and then the following number is going to be its type. So it'll be 7500, meaning it's a Ryzen 7000 series, and it's a Ryzen 5. That's all that means, just so you guys can get a brief understanding of how CPUs work. And I will also explain in a sec what that means for the motherboard, because your type of series you get is going to dictate what kind of motherboard you're going to need. So we'll move over to Intel real quick. So for Intel, this is a Intel i7. You don't really know what gen. So how Intel separates their CPUs is by gen. So anytime you look at a Intel computer, you're going to see gen, and on here I just have, for an example, 10 through 14. 14 being the newest one, 10 being a decently old one. Again, the 3000 series of Ryzen and the 10th gen Intel are both like early 2000s. They're not old, but they're also not new. And then the 9000 series for the Ryzen and the 14th series for Intel are the newest ones. Obviously, Intel is actually coming out with a 15th gen, but that's, I believe, a next year problem. So explaining Intel is also very similar to how you explain the Ryzen CPUs. So for Intel, how they do theirs is kind of like how Ryzen does, how they do theirs with the 9000, because that's just how they have it set up. They have it set up in 1000 series. Intel has a similar theme, except for instead of, starting with a 9000, because they do have a 9th gen. So if you were to get a 9th gen Intel, that 9th gen Intel would be a 9000. But I'm going to start with the 10,000 so it makes sense to you guys, because once you start getting into double digits, it kind of runs with the same theme. So for Intel, I'm going to tell you something funny. So how they do theirs is, instead of being a Ryzen 5, they have an i5 for Intel 5. Kind of funny. Guess what they also have? An i7 and an i9, same as Ryzen. That also has a Ryzen 7 and a Ryzen 9. So Intel and Ryzen have the same theme going on with their CPUs for the types of CPUs. And the only difference between each of their CPUs when it goes to the type is how many cores it has. Do you really care about cores? Only if you're a hardcore computer person. Because really, you could run with a Ryzen 5 or an i5 and you'd still be perfectly fine and wouldn't notice a difference. I moved to a Ryzen 9 just because I wanted to have something. I kind of understand more about how cores work, because the more cores you have, the more processing power your computer has. But obviously, a 2-core difference between my Ryzen 5650 and my Ryzen 5950 isn't much of a difference compared to if I was to move a whole series. Same thing for Intel. Going up 1 or 2 different types compared to just going a whole new generation is a big difference, because the processors are built differently. So how you read an Intel processor, we'll just go with the 11th gen. Say you're wanting to get a 11th gen Intel CPU with and you want to get an i5. So for an 11th gen, it's going to be an 11,500. So 11,500. That's how you would read the CPUs for Intel. The big things I will tell you is there are... Apologies, I keep getting messages. Let me mute my group chat. Anyway, so for reading for when you're going through your CPUs, the other big thing you want to remember is that there's different types of CPUs. And what do I mean by that? Obviously, you have your Intel and your Ryzen. For your CPUs themselves, though, there's 2 types. You have a normal CPU, which is just a straight-up processing unit, and you have integrated CPUs, meaning they have integrated graphics. So the CPU is also your GPU. For Intel, that is identified by a K at the end of the processor. I can't remember exactly what it is for Ryzen, but it's pretty much the same theme. They just add a letter at the end of it, identifying if it's an integrated graphics. The main thing is, if you're going to be building a gaming computer, I would always recommend saving your money and buying a normal CPU and not one that has integrated graphics, because you could save yourself up to between $50 and $100 and put that money towards a dedicated GPU. And you'll also know if it has integrated graphics when you go to buy your component. If you read the description, almost 100% of the time, the CPU description will tell you if it has integrated graphics. So you always want to be on the lookout if it has integrated graphics. But like I said, just remember, your series and your type are 2 things. So, and the last thing I'm going to cover, because we're getting to the 30-minute mark, is I'm going to cover sockets. What does this mean? Sockets, it refers to the center of these motherboards here. So if you see the center of these motherboards, these are referred to as sockets. So what sockets are is what identifies what CPU you're going to be putting in your computer. And what do I mean by that? So for AMD, your Ryzen processors, you have an AM4 socket and an AM5 socket. And what does that mean? So when you go to get a CPU, or if you go to get a motherboard, like I said though, I would always recommend getting your CPU first so you know what type of motherboard you need to get. When you look at these CPUs, you're going to see when you read the description for the 3000 and the 5000 series, they use what is an AM4 socket. Meaning, if you get a 3 or 5000 series Ryzen processor and it has an AM4 socket, but you buy a motherboard that has an AM5 socket, your 3000 and 5000 series CPU won't fit into it. And same thing for the 7 and 9000 series. They use an AM5. So if you buy a motherboard that has an AM4 socket, then you won't be able to use them. And that's the big thing, is compatibility. If you don't have the compatibility for your motherboard and your CPU, you're going to waste your money. So always remember, when you look at your CPU, you want to remember what socket it is. So when you go to look at your motherboard, you want to look at the description and see if it says AM4 or AM5, depending on what series you get. And for Ryzen, I'll tell you, just like I said, simply 3000 and 5000 series, I can tell you right now, both use AM4. And the same thing for 7 and 9, they use an AM5. And it's the same logic behind Intel. So I meant to remove, actually no, yeah, this works. So for Intel, it's the same thing, except for instead of AM, it's LGA. That is your Intel. So if you ever see LGA as your socket for your motherboard, that means it's an Intel CPU. And remember, if you buy an AM5 motherboard, but you buy an Intel CPU, you're not going to be able to use that CPU at all. So what I would always recommend is looking at your CPU first, finding out which, like doing your research, figuring out which one you'd want to get. Personally, for me, I use a 5000 series Ryzen, but some people like the 7000. And for the Intel, I would always recommend between 12th and 14th generation. And I'll explain why I'd recommend any of those 3 generations with the LGA 1700 socket. LGA 1700 can use 12th gen, 13th gen, or 14th gen. You can use 3 different generations in one socket for your CPU for Intel. That's the reason I would always recommend 12, 13, or 14 gen, because with an LGA 1700 socket, you're given a huge range of ability for upgrades for your CPU as compared to Ryzen, where they only have 2 series for one socket type. So, but my main point is read the description of the CPU you're going to get or the motherboard you're going to get, so you can dictate what you're going to get with it. So I'll lay it flat right now. If you're going to get a motherboard, remember to read the description. If it says AM, it's most likely a Ryzen motherboard. Well, it is a Ryzen motherboard. And you want to make sure you look at what type it is. If it's an AM5, you're only going to be able to get a 7000 or a 9000 series. If it's an LGA, then you want to make sure which type of socket. If it's a 1200 series, then you're only going to be able to get a 10th or 11th gen CPU. If it's an LGA 1700 socket, you can get a 12th, 13th, or 14th gen Intel. So just remember compatibility. I always put an emphasis on that because I don't want people spending money and making a mistake and deterring them from building their computer. The biggest thing with building computers for me is always you want to be able to enjoy yourself. You don't want to spend money and then end up wasting it because you don't have the proper compatibility, and then you feel upset because you've lost money and now you never want to do it. Building a computer is an experience that you should always have the chance to do. And so that's why I wanted to make this series, so people can understand what the differences between components are, and so they can understand how to build a computer. But yeah, for this video, I was covering motherboards and CPUs because my biggest thing that I wanted to cover was compatibility. So, and obviously, if you have questions, same as I do in every video, send me an email, ask me a question, I'll give you an answer. If you ever have questions on builds that you want to figure out, I can always help you. If you have questions on socket types, I will get the answer for you. But if you enjoyed, remember, completely optional, but share these videos to a friend so they can also get an understanding if they're big into computers. And, you know, like, subscribe. And I'm going to be continuing this series until I get done covering the basic components. And then I'm going to start moving into building computers so everybody can understand. And remember that if you ever want to have a computer built and I can build it on this channel for you, then just email me and send me, you know, your budget and the description of what you want to build. I'm always down to build a computer and let everybody learn how it goes so then they can understand it. But hopefully you all enjoyed, and I will see everybody later.